When Roman legions crushed Queen Zenobia's army outside Antioch in 272 CE, her commanders braced for execution. What came instead was far more deliberate. Rome had learned something different over centuries of conquest. Death ended suffering too quickly. The empire's real genius lay in breaking people while keeping them alive, turning living monarchs into walking monuments to Rome's supremacy. For queens, this meant facing violence calibrated not just to punish but to obliterate every trace of the person they had been. The legal architecture that enabled this had been built long before Zenobia was born. Under Roman law, prisoners of war existed outside all human protections. The principle of ius gentium, the law of nations, transformed military defeat into legal enslavement. When a city fell or an army laid down arms, everyone inside it became property of Rome or its soldiers. Royal blood meant nothing. A queen held no more legal standing than a common foot soldier in her defeated army. Roman citizens enjoyed protections that seemed absolute. Flogging a citizen was scandal. Executing one without trial provoked outrage among the people and threatened magistrates with political ruin. Foreign captives had no such safeguards. They could be beaten, displayed, sold, or killed, according to the whims of whoever held them. The law extended no exceptions for women and none for those born to rule. The 12 Tables, Rome's foundational legal code from the 5th century BCE, had written these principles in stone. Prisoners taken in war belonged to the Roman state, or to soldiers. Royal women who had worn crowns learned that crowns offered no protection once chains replaced them. Tacitus, the historian whose father-in-law served in Britannia, recorded how Roman administrators treated defeated British nobility without hesitation or doubt, violating those who had commanded armies and administered laws. He describes it not as scandal but as fact, the ordinary operation of Roman power. Female prisoners faced particular vulnerability. The Roman military, built through centuries of conquest and occupation, had developed its own understanding of war's spoils. Some elite captives might be kept in decent conditions while ransoms were negotiated or political value was extracted. Most faced immediate degradation. The distinction between prisoner of war and slave existed only in legal texts. In practice, conquest erased all former status, leaving captive queens at the mercy of men who understood perfectly that the law would not punish them for anything they did. Roman law at home granted matrons property rights, household authority, and social standing within aristocratic hierarchies. This protection disappeared entirely beyond the borders of conquered territories. A woman born to rule descended below the legal standing of domestic slaves, who at least had owners with financial incentive to keep them alive and functioning. Soldiers understood the legal landscape without needing instruction. No prosecution would follow abuse. No trial would examine what they did. No appeal would overturn it. The law had converted captive queens into objects, and soldiers treated them accordingly. This was not cruelty born from passion, but cruelty born from permission explicit, legal, and sanctioned by centuries of Roman precedent. The machinery of Roman domination moved with calendar precision every time a general earned the right to hold a triumph. These ceremonies unfolded only for victories Rome deemed sufficiently significant, and only with Senate authorization. When permission came, the city prepared itself for a spectacle designed to overwhelm consciousness itself. The route stretched from the Field of Mars through the Forum toward the Capitoline Hill, nearly 4 kilometers of streets where Romans packed themselves shoulder to shoulder from dawn until the procession disappeared hours later into the temple above. Musicians led the way, followed by carts bearing artistic representations of conquest, paintings of breached fortifications, models of subdued territories, depictions of defeated armies. Wild animals Rome had captured came next, led in chains through the streets. Elephants, lions, creatures Romans had never encountered before, shuffled under guard, their presence making concrete the geographic reach of imperial power. The crowd's wonder at the animals was calculated into the ceremony's design. Then the prisoners appeared, walking in shackles at the procession's heart. Common soldiers and ordinary captives filed past first columns of bodies that demonstrated the sheer scale of Roman victory. But captive rulers walked at the front of this human parade, separated from the mass of common prisoners. Their prominence was itself degradation. They were displayed as supreme prizes while their display announced their complete powerlessness. The crowd could see exactly what Rome had taken. Captured rulers wore the insignia of their former power. Crowns remained on their heads. Robes of office clothed them. Symbols of authority were visible to thousands. Queens who had commanded armies shuffled forward in chains while crowds jeered and celebrated their humiliation. The contrast was intentional and devastating. By displaying monarchs in full regalia while bound and helpless, Rome communicated a lesson that traveled far beyond the city's walls. No kingdom lay beyond reach. No throne guaranteed anything. Authority meant nothing when Rome decided otherwise. The procession served multiple purposes simultaneously. It proved Roman military capability to potential enemies and allies alike. It satisfied citizens who needed visible confirmation of victory. It provided a stage where those who had resisted Rome faced systematic public degradation, turning individual military defeats into permanent lessons about resistance's futility. Female captives of royal birth endured this, knowing thousands watched them. The journey consumed an entire day, the procession deliberately moving slowly, so spectators along the route could observe every detail. The pace was calculated. Too fast and the crowds would miss what Rome wanted them to see. Moving like a funeral, the route became a gauntlet where the defeated understood they were being observed and judged by masses of hostile strangers. Captive queens walked, knowing they might not see sunset. Some survived the procession, others did not. This uncertainty functioned as its own torture, forcing the defeated to contemplate approaching death with each step through streets lined with celebrating Romans who would never hear them speak or know anything about them, except what Rome had arranged for them to see. Crowds rarely stayed silent. Jeers and insults poured down on captive rulers. For women especially, the abuse took explicitly sexual forms, crowds shouting degradations designed to emphasize vulnerability and powerlessness. They walked exposed, not merely physically but verbally, their bodies and honor subject to commentary and assault from masses they would never face again. The physical demands accumulated hour by hour. Shackles restricted movement and chafed skin wherever metal made contact. Those wearing elaborate chains designed for the most important prisoners felt weight accumulating through endless marching. Feet blistered from hours of walking, legs cramped from immobility. Those denied adequate food during captivity felt hunger gnawing. The Roman summer heat beat down on processional routes where no shade existed. By afternoon, exhaustion became torture itself, a weight pressing down as insistently as the physical chains binding bodies. Some captive rulers held themselves erect despite everything. They refused to show fear or weakness, maintaining dignity through sheer force of will. These acts of resistance were the only defiance available to the utterly powerless. Yet Rome incorporated even dignity into its narrative. The noble bearing of a captive ruler noted later in historical accounts only emphasized the magnitude of their fall. A ruler who walked with authority's bearing while in chains appeared more thoroughly defeated because Rome had preserved their dignity long enough to destroy it publicly. Queen Zenobia had carved an empire stretching from Egypt across Anatolia, challenging Rome's authority throughout the entire eastern frontier. She had been regent for her young son but had consolidated power so completely that she ruled in fact, though perhaps not always in formal title. She commanded armies, negotiated with neighboring powers, administered territories whose wealth compared favorably to Rome's own. Her kingdom controlled trade routes that mattered to empires. Her intelligence and political skill had made her one of Rome's most formidable opponents. Emperor Aurelian crushed her forces in 272 CE and captured her as she fled toward Persia seeking escape. He had won more than a military victory. He had acquired the perfect symbol for an upcoming triumph. Zenobia had proven that women could challenge Roman authority across imperial reaches. Her defeat needed to be absolute and visible to everyone. The Historia Augusta compiled in the 4th century preserves detailed descriptions of Zenobia in Aurelian's triumphal procession of 274 CE. The account, probably drawing on eyewitness testimony, describes a spectacle designed to overwhelm observers with its opulence and its deliberate cruelty. Zenobia walked adorned with jewels that caught sunlight, transforming her into a glittering monument to Rome's power over the wealthiest kingdoms of the East. She was made beautiful for her degradation, her appearance elevated to heighten the impact of humiliation. But observers could not look away from the chains. These were not simple iron shackles restraining movement. Zenobia walked bound in heavy golden chains so massive that guards marched beside her to help support their weight. The choice of gold was deliberate, chosen for specific purpose. These chains symbolized the wealth she had commanded, now transformed into instruments of bondage. Her entire person had become a walking display of conquered riches. Rome had not merely defeated Zenobia, it had weaponized her own wealth against her body. Gold is dense metal, far heavier than iron. Moving through kilometers of crowded Roman streets while weighted down by chains designed to display rather than simply restrain required immense physical endurance. The guards beside her were not there from courtesy but necessity. Without their support, the chains would have pulled her down, forcing her to crawl through Rome's streets on her knees. The image was calculated, Zenobia standing upright only because Roman soldiers held her up. Her dignity maintained solely at Rome's permission. Ancient sources recorded that Zenobia maintained remarkable composure throughout. Despite the weight of golden chains and hours of marching through hostile crowds, she carried herself with dignity. Observers noted her bearing, her refusal to display fear or despair, despite her complete powerlessness. This very defiance may have saved her life. Aurelian, perhaps impressed by her bearing or calculating that she served his purposes better alive than dead, spared Zenobia the execution, awaiting most captive rulers. The emperor granted her a villa near Rome, where she lived out her remaining years. Some accounts claim she married a Roman senator and became part of aristocratic society, her daughters marrying into noble families. Whether this represented mercy or a more subtle form of humiliation remains unclear. She spent her final decades as a living reminder of Rome's power, her very presence in Italian society demonstrating that even the mightiest queens could be reduced to Roman dependence. She had ruled an empire, now she lived on Rome's charity. She had commanded armies, now she commanded nothing. Her continued existence was itself a defeat, slow erasure of everything she had been. The chains had been removed from her wrists, but invisible chains of Roman dominance remained, binding her to the city that had destroyed her kingdom. King Prasutagus of the Iceni died in Britannia in 60 CE, leaving a will designed to protect his kingdom and family. He bequeathed half his territory to Emperor Nero and half to his two daughters, hoping this compromise would preserve Iceni independence while satisfying Rome's demands. It failed. Roman officials led by Procurator Decianus Catus ignored the will entirely. They seized all Iceni lands and property, declaring the entire kingdom forfeit. This was policy, not aberration. Rome had no use for compromises with subjugated peoples. Authority derived from Rome or it was not legitimate authority. Queen Boudica, widow of Prasutagus, and regent for her daughters, protested the violation of her husband's will and her family's standing. She faced punishment that demonstrated how little protection royal status offered to defeated rulers. Tacitus, whose father-in-law Agricola served in Britain during this period and would have heard eyewitness accounts, recorded what followed with unusual directness for ancient historians discussing such matters. His willingness to describe these events reveals how deeply they shocked even Roman sensibilities. Boudica was flogged in public before her people. The whip striking a Roman citizen was considered scandal. Flogging a queen of an allied kingdom constituted deliberate humiliation, calculated destruction of her authority before her own subjects. But Romans proceeded beyond physical punishment. Boudica's daughters, likely teenagers and certainly unmarried, were assaulted by Roman soldiers. Tacitus describes these attacks with sparse language that conveys his own horror at events that violated Roman norms about acceptable conduct. He places these crimes at the center of his explanation for the rebellion that followed. He does not elaborate, yet gravity reverberates through the silence. These assaults were not random violence born of uncontrolled soldiers' lust, but calculated degradation designed to break the royal family and demonstrate Roman dominance. The legal standing of unmarried royal daughters would normally have afforded them protection from the most egregious violations. Conquest erased that protection. They became captive women, subject to their captor's will, stripped of the status that had defined them. The public nature of these crimes multiplied their impact exponentially. This was not violence committed in secret. This was humiliation performed before Iceni people, designed to be witnessed and remembered. By abusing the royal family before their subjects, Roman officials sent a message about the fate awaiting those who questioned imperial authority. The physical abuse and violation were meant to terrorize an entire population into submission. For Boudica's daughters, the violation represented final destruction of their identity. They had been born to royal status, educated to marry strategically, prepared to manage kingdoms and produce heirs. That future was obliterated. They were now marked by what had been done to them, their value as marriage partners destroyed, their place in society shattered. Historical accounts do not record their names or fates. They vanish from the historical record after this violation, absorbed into silence. What happened to them afterward remains unknown. Whether they survived to adulthood, whether they bore children, whether they died by their own hands or lived in obscurity, history records nothing. Roman officials had not merely violated them, they had erased them. The strategy of deliberate degradation backfired spectacularly. Rather than crushing resistance, the abuse of the royal family ignited rebellion that nearly drove Rome from Britain entirely. Boudica raised an army that destroyed 3 Roman cities, including Londinium, massacring tens of thousands of Roman citizens and allies in retaliation. Tacitus preserves a speech attributed to Boudica, in which she declares that she fights not as a queen seeking to preserve her kingdom, but as a woman avenging her abused body and her daughter's violated honor. Whether these are her exact words or Tacitus's reconstruction, the sentiment reflects the magnitude of what had been done to her and her family. The rebellion endured for months before being crushed. It required the full military resources of Roman Britain to suppress, Only Roman discipline and tactical superiority overcame the far larger British forces. Tacitus claims Boudica poisoned herself rather than face capture, choosing death over the humiliation that awaited. Whether this account is true or romanticized remains uncertain. The fate of her daughters goes unrecorded. They vanish from accounts after the initial violation, their stories lost to silence, their names forgotten. As triumphal processions wound toward the Capitoline Hill and Jupiter's temple, captive rulers knew their journey might not end in celebration, but in death. For those marked for execution, the triumph offered only temporary reprieve. They were led from crowds and sunlight to the Mamertine Prison, known in Latin as the Tullianum, an ancient structure built into the Capitoline's northeastern slope. This structure served as final stop for Rome's most notable enemies. While triumphs continued toward Jupiter's temple where victorious generals made offerings, condemned prisoners were led aside to face execution. The Tullianum had held prisoners for centuries, its stone walls absorbing suffering of countless captives. It was old when Rome was young. The prison consisted of 2 levels. The upper chamber served as holding cell where prisoners awaited their fate, isolated from light and the crowds that had surrounded them. The lower dungeon, accessible only through a hole in the ceiling, became the execution chamber. Here, in darkness and filth, Rome's enemies met their end. The method of execution varied. Some were suffocated, airways blocked, desperate, gasping silenced. Others were left to starve, bodies wasting over days or weeks as hunger consumed them from within. The process remained deliberately hidden from public view, occurring while crowds celebrated above. No spectacle attended these deaths. No crowds witnessed final moments of captured rulers. Rome wanted these deaths known but not observed. Vercingetorix unified Gallic tribes against Julius Caesar's conquest, coordinating disparate peoples into military force. He had planned strategies that nearly broke Roman siege at Alesia. In 52 BCE that siege held. His relief force never arrived. His army starved. He was captured. Caesar held Vercingetorix in prison for 6 years after his defeat. 6 years in Roman cells meant degradation and isolation, watching power and vitality drain away. When Caesar's triumph finally came in 46 BCE, Vercingetorix was paraded through Rome. The Gallic leader who appeared bore little resemblance to the warrior who fought at Alesia. 6 years of imprisonment had broken him physically. He was gaunt, hollow, shadow of a man who had once commanded armies. The contrast was devastating. He was Rome's enemy reduced to nothing. After the procession ended, Vercingetorix was led to the Tullianum and executed. History does not record the precise method. Starvation or suffocation was standard. His body was disposed of without ceremony. There was no funeral, no honor, no final resting place. He ceased to exist. Jugurtha, king of Numidia, met similar brutal end after Marius's triumph in 104 BCE. After triumphal display, he was lowered into the Tullianum's lower chamber to await execution. When he descended into that darkness, the king went mad with terror. Complete isolation, knowledge of imminent death, horror of the darkness itself, his mind fractured under the weight. He was left to starve over 6 days, body wasting as hunger consumed him from within. His cries echoed through stone walls while Rome celebrated above. 6 days of agony, 6 days of slow death, 6 days of waiting for release that came only when his body surrendered its struggle. The historian Plutarch recorded his final words. Reportedly, in his delirium, he asked, "How cold this Roman bath is." Whether these were truly his words or later embellishment, they captured the degradation of a once powerful king reduced to madness and death in a Roman prison. Simon Bar Giora led the Jewish revolt that ended with destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. He was captured when Roman siege breached the city's walls. He was displayed in Titus's triumph before being executed at the traditional site in the Forum. Josephus, a Jewish historian who witnessed these events, documented the fate of Simon and other captured Jewish leaders. The triumphal procession paused at Jupiter's temple while messengers awaited word that execution had been carried out below. Only after confirmation of the enemy leader's death did ceremonies conclude. The execution was required before the triumph could be completed, the death a necessary final act of the spectacle. Not every captive ruler faced immediate execution. The decision rested entirely with the triumphant general and increasingly under empire with the emperor himself. Some prisoners proved more valuable alive, serving as permanent symbols of Roman victory or as bargaining tools in future negotiations with resistant kingdoms. A king or queen held in captivity could be offered for release in exchange for tribute or submission. A living captive demonstrated that Rome possessed leverage over their kingdom and family. But for those marked for death, the triumph offered only temporary reprieve. The dignity of procession, gold chains, Robes of office, these trappings of authority, were stripped away after crowds dispersed. What remained was the prisoner alone in the Mamertine's darkness, waiting for the end. The method of execution might vary, but the result remained constant. The captive descended into that darkness, never to emerge. The stone walls of the Mamertine Prison still stand in Rome, a structure that has survived nearly 25 centuries. Visitors can descend into its lower chamber, can stand in the darkness where captive rulers faced their final moments, can see the hole in the ceiling through which bodies were dropped after execution. The physical space remains a memorial to suffering that compels silent contemplation. The flogging of Boudica, the golden chains on Zenobia, the executions following triumphs, the violation of Boudica's daughters, these were not aberrations or excesses born of individual commanders' sadism. They were calculated policies designed to break resistance and display power. Each humiliation sent a message across Rome's empire. Resist, and this will be your fate. Resist, and your death will be slow. Resist, and your family will suffer what you cannot prevent. Resist, and Rome will erase you from dignity, from power, from hope. The systematic humiliation of defeated royalty shaped the fears that kept Rome's enemies compliant for centuries. The weight of golden chains, the hours walking in shackles through jeering crowds, the descent into the Mamertine's darkness, these were not merely individual tragedies. They were mechanisms of empire, tools of control as essential to Roman power as the legions themselves. Rome's strength rested not merely on military superiority, but on the terror it deliberately cultivated, on the willingness to degrade and destroy those who dared oppose it. The triumphs celebrated in ancient texts were built on human suffering. Queens who commanded armies and administered justice were reduced to spectacles. Their degradation transformed into entertainment for crowds who never considered the cost of empire, written in broken lives and stolen dignity. The machinery of Roman power ground forward, indifferent to individual suffering it produced, perfected through centuries of practice into an instrument of extraordinary effectiveness. It was the perfection of that cruelty, its calculated precision, its legal foundation, its public display, that gave Rome the power to dominate its world.